Have you ever witnessed a moment where a person, simply because of their appearance, is asked to leave the seat they paid for, and just 14 minutes later, that same person who was disrespected becomes the reason an entire airline stops to examine itself? That's what happened to Elias Moore, a quiet black CEO who just wanted to go home after a long day. Instead, he was faced with a choice no one wanted: stay silent and endure another injustice, or stand up in the moment when everyone believed he should sit down. If it were you in that moment of being misjudged, treated as if you didn't belong in a place you had entered with your own efforts and money, what would you do? Today's story is not just to recount an incident on a plane. It is to remind us of the most easily forgotten thing, the value of a human being. Join me on this journey. And before we begin, if you believe that respect can save a life, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the story further. There is a distinct sound in the morning at John F. Kennedy Airport. Not too loud, not quite quiet. It is the sound of a big city waking and working at the same time. The sound of suitcase wheels rolling on the tile floor, the hoarse announcements from hours of reading, the voices of people calling each other in the distance. All of it blends together into a lively background that anyone who has ever stepped foot in JFK can immediately recognize. In the first-class cabin of AeroVista Flight AV392, the morning light streamed through the left-hand window, creating a long streak across the dark blue carpet. The cool air from the air conditioning gently brushed against the back of one's neck, refreshing but also enough to make one want to pull one's shirt closer to the body. The atmosphere here was supposed to be the quietest part of the plane. A place of politeness, familiar business faces, and hot espressos served at the right temperature. But that morning, things didn't seem to go the way one would expect. Elias Moore sat in seat 2A. A familiar seat, not because he had sat in it many times, but because it gave him a very special feeling, a feeling of belonging. He placed his small carry-on suitcase beside his feet, still holding the paper coffee cup he had hastily bought in the lobby in front of gate C32. He was in no hurry. After many years as a CEO, Elias had learned to appreciate the remaining minutes before each long flight. The minutes when he could relax his shoulders, let his mind wander from the meetings, the spreadsheets, and the burden of responsibility. In the dim light, Elias's face appeared sharp but calm. His eyes were deep, dark, and somewhat tired. It was the tiredness of someone who had flown across more than 3 time zones in just 2 days, not the tiredness of life. He placed his large hands on the armrest, the cool feeling of the high-quality leather making him a little more alert. Elias just wanted to get back to Los Angeles, back to his son who was expecting him to attend his first piano recital at school. This flight was simply to get home. Not to fight, to show off, to prove anything. But life sometimes likes to choose the most peaceful moments to put on the table an unwanted challenge. A voice rang out from ahead, both polite and distant. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move." The voice belonged to Alyssa Grant, the flight attendant. Her uniform was straight, her name tag was shiny, and her smile was thin and standard. But her eyes said something else. Something very familiar to Elias. He looked up, looking straight at her. Not flustered, just calm. "I think there's a mistake. My ticket is 2A. Alyssa tilted her head, still maintaining her formal smile. "Yes, but this seat is reserved for Legacy Platinum passengers. Perhaps the system has misassigned it. Thank you for your understanding." Elias had heard the phrase, "I beg your pardon," many times. On planes, in hotels, in conference rooms. And sometimes he heard it in such subtle ways that the speaker had no idea what it meant. But Elias did. And today, from the way Alyssa looked at him, the way she took a step back as if afraid to disturb the person who had sat in the wrong seat, he understood very well what the implication was. He put the cup of coffee down on the table, breathing softly and deeply. "I will stay in my seat." The answer was not raised, not sharp nor challenging. It was simply the truth spoken in the tone of someone accustomed to holding firm in the face of other people's prejudices. In that moment, the first-class cabin became strangely silent. A few passengers glanced over, not out of curiosity but because they realized something was about to happen. Alyssa frowned slightly, but she covered it so quickly that the person opposite hardly noticed. "Sir, thank you for your cooperation. We can change your seat." "It's very good. Still first class." "No. I will stay." The air grew thick. It felt as tense as a newly tuned violin string. At that moment, Elias felt his heart tighten, not from fear, but from memory. A very old memory. When he was 16, being asked to leave the high-class reading area of the public library because he didn't look like a student there. The same polite tone, the same judging gaze, the same feeling as if he were an uninvited guest. In that brief moment, Elias struggled internally. Part of him wanted to stand up to avoid the trouble, to avoid all the eyes that were directed at him. But the other part, the deeper part, didn't want to leave his seat again just because others thought he didn't belong here. The atmosphere grew heavier as a passenger looked over from afar, shaking his head slightly in a "I knew it" manner. Another nudged his wife and whispered as if Elias couldn't hear, but he heard it clearly. Every word. Alyssa touched the walkie-talkie, her voice dropping a tone. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call airport security." The words rang out like a faint metallic clang in the still air. Not loud, but enough to draw a line between right and wrong. Elias looked straight at Alyssa. Not worried, just sad. He knew what was happening, and he knew what was coming next. Yet he couldn't get up from his chair, not out of pride, not out of anger, but because he had seen this too many times in his life. In airports, in restaurants, in boardrooms, in places where people should behave with the utmost fairness. In that moment, he could only think of one thing. If he stood up today, what would he leave his son? A lesson in blind patience, or a lesson in maintaining one's position with calmness and respect? Alyssa took a step back, her hand still on the radio. The air was so thick it felt like it was about to burst. A gust of wind blew from the rear cabin light, but enough to make the newspapers on the table flutter. And at that moment, a tall figure appeared at the end of the aisle. His eyes were fixed on seat 2A. The story really begins here. But Elias didn't know. Alyssa didn't know. And none of the passengers holding their breath knew that in just 14 minutes, things would go beyond anything anyone could have imagined. One chair, one person. One small misunderstanding. But sometimes, it's those little things that can change the fate of an entire system. In the tense moment in first class, the morning light from outside still fell on Elias Moore's face, reflecting the peace he tried to keep to himself. But deep in his chest, an invisible weight was shifting, a feeling familiar but never comfortable. It was like a gentle knock on an old memory, slow enough to catch the rhythm but strong enough to make the heart skip a beat. Elias looked down at his hands. They were large, veined, and the knuckles were slightly calloused from 20 years of holding a hot cup of coffee every morning. One would expect the CEO of a logistics giant like Moore Voyant to be used to signing papers and chatting on Zoom, but Elias's life was unlike any of those people imagined. He had worked his way up from manual labor loading cargo for a warehouse since he was 18. To him, those calluses were proof that he had made himself. No one knew that the man who had been asked to leave his seat in first class had built a business from scratch. But that had never mattered to Elias. He had never introduced himself by title, never asked for any special treatment because he had succeeded. He had wanted to be seen as a normal person like all the other passengers in this cabin. However, life is sometimes not as clear as people want. A soft voice sounded at the front of the plane, announcing the passengers' arrival before takeoff. But to Elias, the sound seemed to fade into the background. The only thing he could hear clearly in his head was the voice of his mother, Carolyn Moore, a black woman who had been a nurse for 40 years in Detroit. Her voice was not harsh but contained a steadfastness that he had always felt like his spiritual backbone. Elias, you must choose your own place in life. If you don't choose, someone else will choose for you. And they will always choose the lowest place. Those words were spoken when Elias was 12. A very ordinary day, a very real lesson, yet now they echoed back to him as if she were sitting beside him. Elias closed his eyes, thinking back to his childhood in West Detroit. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it wasn't easy. He remembered the icy winter streets, the yellow lights illuminating the cracks in the brickwork. He remembered the evenings he walked home from school with his father, their breaths rising in the wind like smoke. He remembered his father's voice, Samuel Moore, always calm but sharp. If you want to go far, start by walking straight. Don't let anyone bend your legs just because they see you as different. Those things don't teach you how to avoid trouble. They teach you how to stand up to it. Maybe that's why when Alyssa asked him to leave his chair, he didn't explode. He didn't tense up. He didn't overreact. He was calm, like someone who had been through this more than once in his life. Elias opened his eyes and glanced out the window. Outside, the long runway was catching the first rays of light. The sky was pale and clear, a strange calm he wanted to cling to. He loved the hours before takeoff. They were like a rare pause between two lives, a life of responsibilities, emails, and overlapping meetings. And a small but precious life family. In his pocket he had a small picture his son had drawn for him. A lovely crooked piano with the words scrawled on it, "Daddy, come home soon." Elias pursed his lips. He had promised he would be there today. It was that promise that kept him from making trouble. He wanted the flight to go smoothly. He wanted everything to be okay. But having to stand up just because someone else thought he wasn't fit for this chair, it hurt him in a way that was hard to describe. Not a big pain. Just the kind that makes your heart clench a little. The kind of pain where you're looked at like you're a stranger in your own country. He sighed slowly. No one heard him but him. A man walked across the aisle unconsciously, glancing at Elias with a suspicious look, only for a split second. But Elias recognized it, because he had seen that look enough times, the look of disbelief that he could be sitting here. Elias wondered a question he had never put into words. When would such looks disappear from his life? But he wasn't angry at the man, not at Alyssa, not at the strange looks, because Elias knew that anger wouldn't help him move forward. It would only make him more tired. And he was tired enough. Elias's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. It was an automated text message from the airline about his flight itinerary. A simple notification, but it reminded him Moore Voyant needed him. Employees were waiting for his approval. Shareholders were waiting for an email. But all those responsibilities wouldn't get him out of his chair today. Elias rubbed his forehead. Part of him wanted to stand up to avoid the heavy gaze. Part of him wanted to say, "Fine, I'm moving," and get it over with. But the deepest part, the part of Elias who had been raised to be an adult, wouldn't allow it. If he stood up today, he would forever be the one pushed aside because others thought he didn't belong, and he didn't want that to happen again in his life. In that moment, a strange feeling came over him. It was sad, but calm, a kind of sadness he was familiar with. It was like an old friend he didn't want to see again, but sometimes still appeared at his door. Elias tilted his head slightly, looking at the empty space beside him. He imagined his mother sitting there nodding at him as she had put her hand on his shoulder the day he left Detroit. "Remember what I told you, never leave just because someone doesn't want you there." A deep breath. And then, Elias sat up straight, his eyes fixed on the hatch, a gaze as calm as cold steel. No one in the compartment knew that the man sitting there silently was fighting a battle with himself bit by bit. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to fight for power. He didn't want to make a fuss. He just wanted to preserve one small but important thing, his own respect for himself. And that sometimes takes more than convincing a room full of other CEOs. Footsteps echoed from the end of the passage, a heavy, decisive step. Elias doesn't know it yet, but the person who just appeared will escalate the conflict in the cabin to another level. And from here, the things he's been trying to avoid will gradually pull him into the center of a story much larger than he could have imagined. The air in first class seemed to thicken as the footsteps at the end of the aisle drew nearer. There was a special kind of silence that came in those moments when no one was sure what would happen next. The kind that lingered like a lake before the wind blew, like the sound of a clock in a waiting room as people held their breath waiting for the results. Elias sat there, unmoving, unperturbed. He maintained his usual straight posture, the one that had often made people think he was trying to act tough, when in fact it was the only way to keep from getting caught up in unnecessary emotions. But deep down he was asking himself, am I doing the right thing? Am I making things difficult for everyone? Or is this just a small situation that I should ignore? He knew the truth. This was no small matter, not for him, not for anyone who had ever experienced being looked down upon for their appearance. Alyssa Grant stood before him trying to maintain the composure of a veteran flight attendant, but her eyes said otherwise. They wavered slightly, as if there was a tug-of-war between her professionalism and her own unconscious bias that she didn't want anyone to see. She said it again, this time more firmly. "Sir, I have been very clear. This seat is not for you. As soon as our Legacy Platinum passenger boards the plane, you will need to give up your seat. Thank you for your cooperation." Elias took a slow breath. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to make a scene, but he had to keep the truth. "My ticket," he said, still low and clear, said 2A. There was no reason for me to move. A thin smile appeared on Alyssa's lips. It wasn't a friendly smile. Rather, it was the smile of someone who thought she was handling something obviously. But he was sitting in a Legacy passenger's seat. Charles Whitaker always sat in this seat, every Thursday for 3 years now. I was sure the system had made a mistake. Elias looked at her a moment longer. Not to pressure her, but because he was trying to understand what habit made a person believe the seat belonged to a known passenger rather than the one with the ticket. He kept his voice light. "I don't care who usually sits here. I just know I bought this ticket properly." To the audience listening through TTS, the sentence sounded like the calm surface of a deep river, where the bottom layers of waves were moving. A loud thud followed, powerful, confident, almost used to being given priority. Alyssa immediately stood up straight and turned around slightly. Her eyes lit up with relief, as if her rescue had just arrived. Charles Whitaker appeared in the aisle. His gray suit was neat, the silver watch on his wrist reflected the dim light of the cabin. His face had the features of a man always in a position to make decisions, blunt, somewhat self-judgmental. And when those eyes met Elias, the first thing that came to mind was not kindness or curiosity, but judgmental surprise. He stopped in front of seat 2A. "That is my chair." Not, "Excuse me, there seems to be a mistake." Not, "Let me see your ticket." Just a short sentence, a command. Elias didn't react immediately. He looked up, meeting Charles's eyes. A shiver ran down his spine. Not from fear, but because the words were exactly like the ones he'd heard years ago. "You don't belong here." Even though no one said it like that, the meaning is the same. Alyssa spoke quickly as if to support Charles. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm working on it. It'll be right out. We'll change his chair." At that moment, something inside Elias tightened. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment that crept in like a chill through his chest. In their eyes, it was as simple as repacking a piece of luggage. Charles turned his wrist and looked Elias up and down with his eyes. "Sorry, mate, but this isn't your seat. You know, people have a bit of a habit when they fly first class." Elias put his hands in his lap. He didn't speak right away. He knew an emotional reaction would only make matters worse. He knew people like Charles weren't used to hearing the word no, and he was so used to hearing the word "my friend" in this tone. Charles added, his voice polite but full of meaning. "I don't know how the system assigned this seat to you, but I need to sit in it right now. Alyssa nodded along as if it were obvious. Elias slowly inhaled, then said, his voice steady, "I'm not going anywhere." Not a shout, not a protest, just a statement of fact. But because of that absolutely calm tone, the atmosphere in the cabin changed completely. It was like a taut thread being pulled just a little bit more, enough to feel like it could snap at any moment. Alyssa gritted her teeth slightly. She lost her composure for a moment but quickly regained it. "If you don't cooperate, I'll call airport security." The first-class cabin suddenly became strangely quiet. A few passengers pretended to be on their phones but were actually listening to every word. Some leaned forward but kept their ears focused on them. A middle-aged man in row 3B adjusted his glasses, trying to listen. Elias knew this moment would go beyond the chair. Part of him wanted to sigh and say, "Okay, I'm leaving." Part of him wanted to leave this world for a few minutes to avoid the eyes that were staring at him as if he were a nuisance. But the deepest part of him, the part that had been nurtured by his parents' teachings, said he couldn't stand up. Not today. Not this time. Elias spoke slowly, each word as if placed on the table very lightly but very firmly. "You can call whoever you want, but I'll stay in my seat." Charles let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh of someone who can't believe he's being rejected. "Who do you think you are?" No one knew that. Half a second before answering, Elias pursed his lips slightly to keep his composure. He didn't want to say anything in anger. He wanted to keep his dignity. Elias replied, his voice low and calm, "A passenger with a valid ticket. That's all." At that moment, Charles's eyes turned cold. Alyssa clenched her hand on the walkie-talkie, and a few seconds later, the call rang out. "Security requested at first-class cabin. Repeat. Security requested." Several passengers gasped audibly. There were only a dozen people in the compartment, but it felt like hundreds of gazes were focused on Elias. He sat still, not shaking, not angry, just silent. Because he knew this was far from over. Just a few minutes after Alyssa's security call, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin changed to a different shade of tension. It was no longer the silent discomfort of suspicious glances. It was no longer the scattered whispers. This time the atmosphere was thick, as if everyone was wondering if something serious had just begun. Elias remained seated in seat 2A. Drogon, the plane's name was AV392, was still loading baggage below, so the cabin wasn't completely closed. People were allowed to move around, but no one dared move. Most passengers only turned their heads slightly, glancing toward the middle of the aisle, and they saw Elias. A dark man, silent, his hands clasped in his lap, his back as straight as a steel pillar, his gaze fixed ahead with a strange calm. No anger, no resistance, no trouble, just sit in the chair you paid to sit in. It is what keeps many people silent, to the point that they themselves feel suffocated. Alyssa stood next to Elias, her hands on the radio in front of her chest. She tried to remain professional, but her throat tightened as if she were trying to swallow something that wouldn't come out. She knew calling security was a big step, one that training always emphasized taking into account. But somehow, in a moment of ego-overpowering composure, she pressed the call button. Charles Whitaker stood with his arms folded behind him, his face full of displeasure. He tilted his head left and right as if checking to see if anyone in the cabin was taking Elias's side. His eyes narrowed slightly and his voice was thick with contempt. Ridiculous. Had to call security just for a seat. Elias heard clearly, but he did not turn, did not reply, did not react. The fact that he remained so calm made some passengers feel a little choked up. A middle-aged woman gently touched her husband's hand, as if to ask with her eyes, "Is this true?" The husband just shrugged slightly, but he avoided looking Elias in the eyes. A few seconds later, loud, decisive footsteps echoed outside the cabin door. 2 JFK airport security officers appeared. One was a tall, brown man in his late 40s. The other was a younger woman, her quick eyes scanning everything in a split second. The man stepped forward, introducing himself in a low but polite voice. "This is Officer Raymond Holt. We have received a report of an uncooperative passenger. There was no malice in his voice, no prejudice, just a man doing his job. Elias looked up at him. His gaze was so calm that Raymond paused for a moment. It wasn't like the security calls he had handled. No one yelled. No one yelled. No one fought. No chaos. There was only one man sitting in his correct chair. Alyssa immediately stepped forward, her voice raised as if she finally had the power to back her up. "Officer, this passenger is not seated as intended. This seat belongs to a Legacy Platinum passenger. He has been asked to move multiple times, but has refused to cooperate." Raymond nodded slowly. He looked at Elias, then at the ticket, then at Alyssa, all in a matter of seconds. The female officer behind him followed suit, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Alyssa's expression. Raymond asked directly, "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" His choice of words, calm, direct, and respectful, diminished the mood a bit. Elias looked straight at the officer. "I have a ticket for seat 2A. I don't want to move anywhere. No security reasons. No system error. Just..." He paused for a second. "They want me to stand up and return the seat to their regular customer." Raymond glanced at Charles. Charles raised his voice slightly. "That's the seat I always sit in. I'm a Legacy passenger. For 3 years now. I don't know why the system gave it to..." He didn't finish his sentence, but everyone heard the implication. An implication that made the atmosphere in the cabin tense with an indescribable tension. Officer Raymond looked closely at Charles for another second, but he did not react. He just continued asking, "Are you causing trouble or bothering anyone?" Elias replied softly, "Are not." Alyssa interjected, "He is obstructing proper seating arrangements." Raymond looked at her again. "As a rule, seat rearrangement only happens for safety reasons, right?" Alyssa paused slightly. The question was like a thin blade that pierced her most fear. Because she knew well this was not about safety. She pursed her lips and lowered her voice. "Yes, but this is a special case." The female officer spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but sharp. "Special? For what reason?" It took Alyssa a few seconds to find an answer, but all the reasonable answers were non-existent. Raymond bent down to look at Elias's ticket again, carefully, precisely. Then he looked at Alyssa with an expression that was hard to read, not harsh but no longer neutral. "This passenger has a valid ticket. It says 2A. There is no safety reason to change seats." He said it calmly, but to many it was like a heavy sentence. Charles burst out laughing in disbelief. "What are you saying? Are you defending him? This is an internal airline matter, not..." Raymond turned around looking straight at Charles with a completely professional gaze. "Sir, it is my job to ensure that no one is asked to leave their post improperly. That's all." A long silence fell. Alyssa realized that everything was slipping away from her. Her voice became more urgent. "Officer Holt, I'm just trying to maintain flight procedures." "We can't." And just then, a small but clear voice like the ringing of a bell rang out from behind. "I saw what happened. I saw everything." The whole cabin turned around. It was a white woman in her late 30s, her hair tied low, carrying a travel backpack. Ruby Dawson, passenger in seat 3C. She took a step forward. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were unusually clear. "I saw it from the beginning. He did nothing wrong. He just sat in his chair, that's all." Alyssa stared at Ruby as if she couldn't believe her ears. Ruby continued, this time stronger. "I also heard her say Mr. Whitaker always sits in this seat, as if this seat belonged to him rather than to the person who bought the ticket." And then Ruby said something that made several passengers fall silent. "If he were white, would you ask him to stand up?" Frozen space. Alyssa turned pale. Charles rolled his eyes. Raymond looked at Ruby with heavy eyes. And Elias. He just looked down at his hands. A flash of pain crossed his eyes, not because Ruby had said something wrong, but because she had said something he didn't want to hear out loud. The female officer stepped forward, looking at Ruby gratefully. "Are you sure? Can you see everything?" Ruby nodded vigorously. I'm sure. A ripple of excitement spread through the cabin. Many passengers turned to each other, some nodded slightly, some looked confused because they had thought the same thing but did not dare to say it. Raymond stood up straight, his voice resolute. I don't see this passenger breaking any rules. There's no reason to ask him to leave his seat. There's no resistance. There's no disturbance. He's sitting in his correct seat. He turned to Elias. Sir, you can continue sitting in seat 2A. A simple sentence. But it echoed in Elias's heart like a sigh of relief that he had kept for many years. Alyssa opened her mouth to protest but then closed it again. She knew the situation was beyond her control. Charles, his face red with humiliation, could only say, unbelievable. Elias did not look at him, did not look at anyone. He only said one sentence very softly, not thanks for the victory, but thanks because finally the truth is told. But little did he know. This was just the first step of the biggest wave AeroVista had ever faced. After Officer Raymond Holt's confirmation, the first-class cabin swayed as if on water buffeted by a strange wind. Everything was no longer as it had been. The initial luxurious silence was replaced by a different kind of silence, a silence filled with the weight of things one does not want to see but must face. Elias sat there, his hands still on his lap, but his breathing became a little easier. Not a sigh of relief, but the kind of sigh one gets when one has been holding on to a grudge for too long, and the moment of truth isn't a joy, it just relieves the tension. Raymond turned to his colleague, Officer Jenny Alvarez, for a brief glance. She nodded, then stepped back to take a closer look. No one wanted to escalate the situation, but they all sensed this was about more than just the chair. Charles Whitaker stood there, his lips pressed together. His anger was no longer just ordinary annoyance, it was something offended. As if Elias holding seat 2A was a personal insult to him. He lifted his chin and said in a tone that was both annoyed and embarrassed, You mean, I have to sit somewhere else? Me, Legacy Platinum, Raymond said clearly. You will sit in the seat assigned to you by the system on this flight. Charles growled, I have not sat in a seat other than 2A for the past 3 years. Jenny spoke, her voice short and clear. 3 years or 30 years does not constitute ownership of the chair, sir. A passenger coughed slightly to cover his laughter. Charles blushed and glared but said nothing more. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense. Some wanted to be on the right side but remained silent as if afraid that their participation would prolong the conversation. Others turned to their companions, whispering to each other with their eyes. No one left. No one dared to break the silence that was threatening to break into an argument. Ruby Dawson, who had testified, was still behind her, clutching the strap of her backpack. She looked at Elias and he nodded in silent thanks. Ruby felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't full of gratitude, but the gratitude of someone used to standing up for herself, suddenly having someone else stand up for her for the first time. Ruby pursed her lips as if she wanted to say more but then stopped. She was afraid that if she said too much, the conversation would become personal. But her eyes were full of meaning. She knew she had done the right thing. Alyssa Grant felt the collar of her uniform tighten. Sweat beaded her forehead, but she kept her face stoic. She had never been put in a position to be questioned like this. In her training, she had been taught to maintain the professional image of the company. But no one had taught her how to handle moments when others might see the flaws in her own habits. She tried to calm herself down with a steady voice. It was just a misunderstanding. I just wanted the flight to go as planned. Raymond did not blame, but he did not let the remark slip either. Misunderstandings are easy to come by, but when it comes to asking a passenger to leave their seat without a valid reason, he stopped and looked straight at her. It's no longer a misunderstanding, Miss Grant. Elias bowed his head ever so slightly, a bow of acknowledgement he was all too familiar with in this society. But he did not let sadness overtake him. He replaced it with a different calm, the calm of someone who already knew what was about to be said. And then suddenly, another voice rang out. Excuse me, "I'd like to say something." Everyone turned. A petite Asian woman in her early 40s from seat 1C. Her hair was tied back, her expression not harsh but rather frank. She stood up, something no one in the compartment thought anyone else would dare do after Ruby. "Her name is Nina Beaumont," Nina said in a soft but sharp voice. "I saw the whole thing too. He was just sitting in the right seat. He did nothing wrong. And Mr. Whitaker," she looked straight at Charles. He frowned. "He asked him to stand without asking why or checking his ticket. He said, 'That's my seat,' as if that was enough to make someone bow their head." The atmosphere seemed to take a step back. But Nina didn't stop there. "Not stopping there. Miss Grant, I heard you clearly when you told him this seat will be ready for you shortly." "Before you knew anything about his ticket." Alyssa stiffened. Ruby and Nina, two different women, two different perspectives, but both witnessing the same thing. Nina added, her voice lower but sharp as a thin blade. "I've flown AeroVista for 12 years. I've seen this before. Only, this time someone wasn't silent. A truth was revealed. Softly, but enough to make the cabin vibrate from within." Elias looked at Nina. His eyes held surprise but also respect. The ability to stand up for others always touched him because it was so rare, especially when the truth was uncomfortable. Raymond nodded slightly at Nina as if acknowledging the necessity of her words. Then he turned to Elias. "You don't have to leave your seat. You're in full compliance." Elias replied softly, "I understand. And thank you for clarifying." But inside Elias there was another layer of emotion. He knew he was about to be looked at in a new way, not just by the passengers but by the system itself. It was both a relief and a pain. A male passenger in seat 4A, an older man with gray hair, cleared his throat, then spoke loud enough to be heard. "Actually, I think he's behaving very properly. Maybe more properly than many people here." His words were like raindrops falling on glass that was about to crack. Charles turned back to look at the old man, both annoyed and in disbelief that anyone would dare to side with Elias. The atmosphere changed. This time it was no longer a silence because people did not want to interrupt. It was a silence because people began to wonder, how long have I been silent? How much have I witnessed without saying anything? Another woman's voice whispered, "Maybe he wasn't wrong. Actually, maybe everyone had thought so from the start." Alyssa took a tiny step back. No one noticed, but to her it was a step back that made her heart sink. She realized something, a feeling she had never felt before: shame. Not ashamed of being caught, but ashamed because in that moment she understood she had been unfair. Elias knew it. He felt it. He did not gloat. He did not triumph. He only looked toward the hatch where the light from the corridor reflected in. The light said nothing, but to him it was like a deep silence opening, a silence he knew the first wave had come, but the next would be much bigger. Raymond and Jenny were about to leave the cabin, but before leaving, Raymond stopped and said softly, "If anything happens, call us. We'll be right around the corner." He nodded. The sentence, though short, carried more weight with Elias than others could understand. As security stepped out of the cabin, eyes returned to Elias. But this time they weren't suspicious, not judgmental, not contemptuous, but the look of someone trying to understand, of someone witnessing something. Right, stand up. For Elias, that was the moment that softened his heart. But he didn't know this story hadn't reached its climax yet, because the next 14 minutes would change the fate of both AeroVista Airlines and his own. After Raymond and Jenny left the cabin, the tension in the air seemed to have increased to another level. Even though they had left, their presence still lingered in every glance and every movement of the people sitting in the first-class cabin. Elias was still sitting in seat 2A, his figure calm, but his eyes were deeper than before. No one knew that behind that calmness was a series of intertwined thoughts, layer upon layer, like thin pencil lines drawn on a white sheet of paper. He placed his hands on the small table in front of him, his fingers tapping out a steady rhythm. There was no trace of anger in the tapping. It was more like the rhythm of someone observing himself. Elias wasn't angry at anyone, but he was facing a truth he had tried to avoid for years. No matter how far he went, no matter how successful he was, there were still moments when he was pulled back to square one because others saw him differently. That hurt, even though he didn't show it. In the silence of his thoughts, a strange feeling crept in, a doubt as deep as the base. Not of self-doubt, but of the world he lived in. Were people like him ever truly seen? Not by their job title, not by the money they made, but as human beings. The thought made his heart sink, like someone had placed a stone lightly on his chest. Not so heavy that he couldn't breathe, but enough that he felt it there. While Elias was thinking, Charles Whitaker at the back of the cabin was having his own silent rage. He was leaning against the cabin wall, his arms crossed, his lips pursed until they were white. A man accustomed to being pampered, to having priority, to being served in a way that no one could argue with, was now being flatly denied in the very place he believed he had privilege. What annoyed him most was not that Elias stole his seat, it was that people dared to stand by Elias. He turned to Alyssa, his voice low but sharp. "This can't be left like this. I'll report this straight to the management." Alyssa swallowed. She heard his voice and knew it was no empty threat. She looked at Elias still sitting there, oblivious to the anger simmering behind him, and for a split second she felt a strange emotion. Not anger, not hate, but confusion. Confused because Elias didn't show any hostility, didn't react defensively, didn't attack her, didn't try to prove her wrong. He just kept his position. And that made her feel uncomfortable in a way she didn't expect. Alyssa took a deep breath and returned to her seat. She needed to calm down. She needed to sort things out before Charles escalated the situation. But then something small happened, something that made Alyssa even more uneasy. A young male passenger in his 30s of Latin American descent leaned over from row 3D and whispered to Elias, "Sir, I just want to say, I think you're right. I see everything. And I hope you keep your word." His voice was soft, but full of goodwill. Elias smiled politely, very thinly. "Thank you." The way he said it made the man pause. It was the kind of thanks of someone who was used to fending for himself, not expecting help, not relying on anyone. A slight feeling of pity crossed the young man's eyes. Up ahead, Ruby Dawson leaned over the table, taking a deep breath as if her courage from earlier still resonated and made her heart race. She glanced at Nina Beaumont, who sat still but kept her eyes on Elias. A silent sympathy formed between the two women, one outspoken, the other calm. Neither said a word to the other, but both knew what they were saying wasn't just to protect Elias. It was to protect the right part of themselves. Charles lowered his voice again resentfully. "I can't believe they're siding with him. It's too much." Elias heard, but he still did not react. What hurt him wasn't even the words, it was how familiar he was with them. It was as if he had learned to live with those words since he was young without letting them touch the softest part of his heart. He closed his eyes for a second, just a second, but it was enough to feel the weariness ripple through him. No one saw it, no one except one person. Nina Beaumont watched Elias silently. She saw the moment his eyes closed, saw the way his shoulders slumped, then rose again, saw the way he kept himself calm with the steadiness of his breathing. She knows that feeling, the feeling of having to be calm even when you are not calm anymore. She stood up, approached Elias, her voice soft as a whisper. "Are you okay?" Elias opened his eyes. His gaze was deep but warm. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Nina didn't ask what he thought. She just placed a hand on the arm of the chair as a wordless gesture that he didn't have to face everything alone. Only for a brief moment. But it made Elias feel something he hadn't felt all morning, that there were people who actually saw him. Alyssa saw that scene from behind. A pang in her chest, not because of jealousy, but because she felt that this gentleness should have come from herself in the first place. she said softly, as if talking to herself. I should have handled it differently. No one heard. No one answered. But in Alyssa's heart a ripple began to form. It was as small as the sound of water dripping onto the surface of a lake, but it was enough to create a widening circle. Charles, on the contrary, became more impatient. He spoke louder, no longer restraining himself. I will report this. I want to know who is responsible for this chaos. His eyes were fixed on Alyssa, and Elias understood in that moment he saw this as a personal affront, a challenge to power. He could not accept that someone, not him, had forced him to move. Elias wanted to say something to him, something simple, something gentle, but he kept silent, and it was that silence that made Charles even more uncomfortable. Elias turned to the window, letting the morning light hit his face. The light reminded him of his son, of last night's piano practice on video call, of the little laugh when the boy said, "Dad, come home early." Those memories made him feel stronger. He said to himself, I'm not here to win. I'm here to not lose myself. At the back of the compartment, Ruby whispered to Nina, "This might not be over yet, right?" Nina nodded slightly. "Not yet. I think it's just beginning. Like a silent prophecy." She doesn't know the exact extent of it. Elias did not know. Alyssa doesn't know. Even Charles, who was burning with anger, didn't know. But in just a few minutes, a small event outside the window would turn the whole story around, something no one expected. And when it happens, every gaze, every judgment, every prejudice in this compartment will be forced to change. Not because Elias wanted to, but because the truth would inevitably come out. The noise in the first-class cabin had calmed down, but the tension still lingered like a thin layer of mist that refused to lift. No one spoke loudly, no one argued, but every seat, every breath, carried an invisible pressure that made the luxurious space no longer feel like an expensive airline cabin. It felt like a waiting room where everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one could predict which way it would turn. Elias Moore looked out the window. Outside, the morning light shone down on the tarmac, reflecting off the metal of the wings. From his position, he could see the left wing of the AeroVista AV392. The metal surface was clean, but the underside, the part that most people rarely paid attention to, stung Elias's eye in a strange way. He squinted slightly. Something darker than the usual metallic color. Not a shine, not a water stain. Looks like oil. Elias tilted his head slightly, trying to observe from a different angle. He wasn't sure. Maybe it was just a reflection. Maybe it was just old rain that hadn't dried yet. But he had worked in logistics for more than 20 years. And not office logistics, real logistics, where he had stood alongside maintenance workers, watched cargo being loaded onto planes, watched machinery being serviced. He knew the smell of oil. He knew the color of oil. He knew how leaks could start out so small they were almost invisible. He frowned slightly, a slight uneasiness creeping up his spine. At the same time, Charles Whitaker continued to vent his anger into the air, saying to Alyssa, in a voice trembling with anger, "This is the worst thing I have ever seen. I can't believe they let me stand here and be humiliated like this. When will I get my seat?" Alyssa bit her lip. For the first time all morning, she didn't have the confidence to say immediately. She only replied in a weaker voice than usual, "Sir, I am awaiting instructions from the chief steward." Charles let out a deep snort. He turned to Elias as if taking all his anger out on one person. "All this is your fault." Elias did not turn around, did not respond, did not look directly at her. He just looked at the dark streak below the wing of the plane, his eyes so focused that every word passed through him without leaving a trace. Ruby Dawson, sitting behind him, had been watching Elias. She saw a strange look in his eyes. Not the look of someone sad or offended, but the look of someone who had just discovered something important. Ruby leaned up slightly. "What are you looking at?" Elias slowly pointed to the left wing. "See, right near the hinge of the wing, something darker than usual." Ruby squinted. Even though she couldn't see clearly, she could see something was off, a long, faintly reflective streak that didn't look like water. Nina Beaumont, hearing this, also stood up and looked. Just then, another person saw. A little girl about 10 years old, sitting next to her mother in row 4C, whispered, "Mom, why is the plane leaking?" The little girl's mother started, looked at her, and her eyes widened. Elias turned to look at the passengers around him. He spoke softly but clearly, "I'm not sure, but it looks like we have a problem on the left wing." Alyssa heard and quickly walked over. "What did you say?" Elias did not change his tone. "I see a dark streak. Could be oil, could be a hydraulic leak. I can't say for sure, but in my experience this isn't normal." Alyssa frowned. He is not an aircraft engineer. It wasn't meant to be mean. It was just the reaction of someone who had worked in the airline industry for so long and trusted the airline's procedures. But it made a few passengers turn to look at her, because they realized if this was an oil leak, it was much more serious than a seat squatting incident. Nina frowned. "Miss Grant, I see something. At least you should report it to the technician to check." Alyssa looked at them. Something was torn between her eyes, an instinctive sense of duty to the firm and a fear of being seen as too cautious. Charles laughed loudly, full of sarcasm. "Holy shit, he wants to be an engineer now. Don't let him drag everyone into this joke." A shh sound came from somewhere. Charles gasped, surprised at being told to be quiet. Elias looked at Charles for a long moment. Not angry, not upset, just sad. Then he said, his voice very calm, "I'm not kidding. If I'm wrong, engineering will confirm. But if I'm right, everyone in this cabin needs to know before we take off." Alyssa swallowed. She turned to the cabin door, looking down at the ground below. Technicians were finishing up their final checks. One of them, Jordan Reyes, was making notes on a chart. Hesitate for a moment big enough to make a change, Alyssa decided. She took the walkie-talkie, her voice tense. "This is Grant in first class. I need a technician to check the left wing, specifically the outer hinge near the flap control. There's a possible fluid leak." Some passengers let out a soft gasp. Others tightened their seatbelts reflexively. Ruby placed her hand on her chest, silently thanking Elias for noticing. Charles glared. You can't be so serious. This is just a stall for time so he can keep his seat." Alyssa turned to look at him for the first time with a calm gaze. "Mr. Whitaker, if there is a 1% chance of a technical problem, I cannot ignore it." Nina looked at Alyssa, nodding slightly, a silent acknowledgement. A few minutes later, Jordan Reyes, an AeroVista technician, climbed through the front door, his cheeks smeared with oil and ash. He walked quickly to the window Elias had pointed to. Jordan leaned down, looked closely, and then his lips curved down in a way no one wanted to see. Alyssa swallowed his. "Is there a problem?" Jordan sighed, his voice thick. "Yes. It's not rainwater. It's not wash water. It's hydraulic fluid. And it's leaking." A murmur shook the whole cabin. Jordan continued, "If the plane takes off in this condition, the possibility of losing flap control is very high. The flight must be postponed immediately." Alyssa turned pale. Nina put her hand over her mouth. Ruby whispered, "Oh my God." Charles was stunned, not because he was worried for his safety, but because the truth had just slapped his pride. Alyssa turned to Elias, her eyes filled with surprise. How can you see?" Elias said only one sentence. "No boasting, no ostentation. Because I've stood in cargo holds like this for over 10 years. A deep silence. A silence where all prejudices were swept away like dust." Jordan Quay sang, "Alyssa, I need to notify the captain immediately. We must evacuate all passengers for emergency maintenance." Alyssa nodded. Her voice was shaky but clear. "I understand. I will let you know right away." As Jordan left, the entire cabin's gaze fell on Elias. No longer doubt, no longer contempt, no longer prejudice, but it is respect. very sincere, very deep. A man sitting in 4A whispered to the person next to him, "If it weren't for him, I don't know what would have happened." Ruby looked at Elias with emotional eyes. "You saved everyone." Elias said nothing. He just looked out the window again. A slight breeze stirred the oil slick a little, as if confirming what he had seen. In his heart there was a very strange feeling, both relieved and sad. Light because he prevented an accident. Sad because he had to prove his worth by saving an entire flight just to be seen as a human being. The intercom sounded light but heavy, like an end to the whole journey that seemed about to begin. In the first-class cabin, everyone held their breath as the captain's voice spoke, calm but a bit heavy. "Dear passengers, due to a technical issue, we have had to cancel the flight to ensure absolute safety. Please remain calm and follow the flight attendant's instructions." No one breathed a sigh of relief. No one complained. The silence was the clearest indication that they all knew they had just escaped an accident they had no idea about. Alyssa Grant stood at the front of the cabin, her face no longer as stiff as before. She looked like someone who had just lost something, not her position, but her confidence in her own judgment. As the passengers began to stand up, Alyssa suddenly turned to Elias, her voice low but sincere. "If you hadn't seen that, I don't dare think what would have happened." Elias looked at her and said softly, "I just did what anyone who was skeptical would do. No big deal." But for Alyssa, that statement was not a small one. It stripped away a layer of self-esteem that she had always relied on confidently, the self-esteem that I am the one who understands planes best here. Now she understood sometimes the person who understands the problem best is the one no one notices. As the passengers began to leave the cabin, many eyes turned to Elias. The scrutiny was gone. Nodding, soft words of thanks, meaningful eye contact. "Thank you. You saved the day. We owe you a debt of gratitude." An elderly man stopped in front of Elias, placed his hand on the back of a nearby chair, and said softly, "I have never been on a plane knowing there was danger ahead. Thank you for staying quiet." Elias smiled. It was a smile more sad than happy. Because he knew to be recognized, he had to prove what no one else wanted to prove by risking his life, by not being trusted in the first place. As the crowd gradually cleared from the compartment, only a few remained longer, among them Ruby Dawson and Nina Beaumont. Ruby approached Elias, her voice still slightly trembling. "You know, you made me rethink the way I look at things. Usually, I just keep quiet when things happen. But when you stood up, I realize not everyone has the courage to do that." Nina slowly nodded. "And sometimes a person's intuition is more important than their position." Elias thanked them with his eyes, then gathered the small backpack at his feet. He stood up slowly, as if contemplating every last breath in this tumultuous cabin. He touched the edge of seat 2A before leaving. Something made him think it was just beginning. The jetway connecting the cabin to the terminal was no longer as busy as usual. Passengers walked in a state of mixed relief and panic. The murmurs began to spread like tiny needles in the air. He saw the oil stain before the technician did. "I thought it was just a matter of changing seats, but who would have thought? The airline will have to explain this. I took a video. I should probably post it to warn others." Some of them had their phones open. They didn't film the screaming or the arguing. They filmed Elias calmly pointing out what was wrong. They filmed Jordan confirming it was an oil leak. They filmed Charles Whitaker's horrified look as he realized he was wrong. A video of less than 20 seconds has already gone viral with angry hand gestures. "Customer notices hydraulic leak before staff." One short title, one big story. Elias walked slowly with the crowd, his shoulders relaxed but his steps heavy. There was no joy in his mind. Just a very human feeling, the feeling of the truth coming out but mixed with sadness at paying a price no one should have to pay. As he stepped out of the tunnel, Charles Whitaker suddenly stopped him. No more arrogant face. No more commanding tone. Just an old man facing the greatest shame of his life. Whitaker opened his mouth, but his voice seemed stuck somewhere. I said the wrong things. I misunderstood you. Elias gently placed his hand on his shoulder. You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself an apology. Charles stood still, his eyes watering. Not because he was offended, but because for the first time he saw his reflection in the mirror in a way that was so unpleasant that he could not avoid it. Once all the passengers had left the plane, the AeroVista engineering team gathered around the left wing like bees around a hive in trouble. Tools, flashlights, pressure gauges, wipes were brought out continuously. Jordan leaned down and said to his team, "We're lucky. If this flight had taken off, they'd all be in danger." Another young technician asked, "Who discovered it first?" Jordan looked towards where the passengers had left, his eyes deeper. A passenger, not an employee, not an engineer, a passenger. And there was a layer of emotion in that statement, respect, mixed with a hint of self-reproach, because they should have been the first to notice. In the terminal, the airline staff had been ordered to urgently transfer passengers, but the center of attention at that moment was still Elias. A group of people approached, including a few passengers, an airport staff member, and the person who had posted the video earlier, a young man who was trembling with excitement. "Mr. Moore, your video is going viral. Everyone wants to know what happened." Elias breathed slowly. He felt what he had been avoiding all this time, reaching out to touch him, public attention. "I don't like it. I just want things to be right. I just want people to be safe." Ruby stood nearby and whispered, "You still have a chance to say the right thing when the matter has not been distorted." The words sparked something in Elias. A different sense of responsibility. Responsibility to truth, not to reputation. He nodded, stepped out in front of the group, his voice calm. "I just felt like something was wrong, and I thought if anyone saw anything unusual they should say something. Not because I'm special, but because the safety of everyone on this flight is more important than any seat, any location." Cameras immediately shot up. Questions were about to be asked, but Elias waved his hand gently. "I will say, but only what is necessary. As for the rest, please let the company handle it." One person asked loudly, "Do you feel you are being treated differently?" Elias breathed lightly, his eyes looking into the space behind the crowd where the light falling on the floor seemed to split everything in two. "I don't want to talk about how people see me. I just want to say this. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the technical error. It's the warnings we ignore from people we don't trust." The whole station was silent, a heavy metallic silence. Ruby looked at Elias and understood he wasn't speaking to win, he was speaking to heal. But this healing was just the beginning of a big wave that even he didn't know where it would lead. The news spread faster than any footstep leaving the airport. As Elias Moore left the airstrip, the phones of the passengers around him started buzzing. Not personal messages, not work emails, notifications from news sites, social media platforms, local news channels. Some people standing right in the hall before they could go far opened their eyes wide. "It's trending. Over 200,000 views. Just 8 minutes ago, Ruby Dawson got the message too." She turned back to Elias, who was still walking slowly like someone trying to avoid falling into the eye of a storm. She called softly, "Elias, things are getting serious." Elias stopped and turned. His eyes were still calm, but there was a hint of thought in them, as if he understood that things were no longer in anyone's control. A group of passengers approached. They didn't crowd around Elias for an autograph or a photo. They just wanted to say one simple thing: "You saved us. The rest, let the public speak for themselves." Elias nodded slightly, but without any sign of pride. He simply took a step back, as if to give space to those who were moved before him. Meanwhile, at AeroVista's Information Control Department, chaos had begun. Dozens of press releases poured in at once, repeatedly asking for confirmation. Did the passenger discover the error before the technician? Was there discrimination on the flight? Why did the airline ignore the passenger's warning? The media, staff who were used to dealing with scandals more slowly, turned pale. A young female employee turned to her superior. What should we do? The video is going viral. The department head swallowed. Contact the CEO immediately. This is no longer a minor incident. Outside the platform, Elias had gone quite a distance, but Ruby still kept up. She was confused, like someone trying to run after something bigger than herself. Elias, maybe you should leave the airport before the press arrives. Elias stopped right next to a large steel pillar, the white light of the platform shining on his face, giving him a feeling of both determination and fatigue. He replied slowly, "If I leave, won't it look like I'm running away?" Ruby sighed. "I'm just afraid all this will force you into the public spotlight in a way you don't want." Elias looked at her with a gentle but deep gaze. "The focus is not important. What is important is that the truth is seen. If I kept quiet just because I was afraid of making noise, then what was the point of me standing up just now?" Ruby was silent. A simple sentence, but contained so many things that she did not expect. That's why Elias is different. Not because he's a CEO, not because he has a reputation, but because he doesn't back down from doing what's right, even when it puts him at risk. In the inner area of the station, Charles Whitaker stood there alone, holding lightly onto the armrests of his chair, like someone trying to regain his balance after a severe shock. He looked around, his eyes searching for some way out of his embarrassment, but there was none. The looks from the passengers, though polite, carried something that could not be hidden: disappointment. An airport employee stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, would you like us to assist you with a transfer?" Charles shook his head. He couldn't think about flying again right now. The only thing he knew for sure: I was wrong, completely wrong, and I have to face it. He wiped his face with his hand, then looked towards Elias in the distance, standing next to Ruby. "I was looking at the wrong person." The words fell out silently, but were as heavy as a confession to himself. By then, a line of people was approaching Elias, a few local journalists, and nearly a dozen curious passengers eager to see what happened next. A young female reporter wearing a Channel 12 News name tag stepped forward. "Mr. Moore, this is Marissa with Channel 12. Can you share what happened on the flight?" All eyes turned to Elias. A silence fell so quiet you could hear someone's footsteps on the polished tiles behind them. Elias took a deep breath and replied, "I'll just say one thing. If anyone feels something's wrong, they deserve to be heard, no matter what seat they sit in, what they're wearing, or what they look like." Nina Beaumont heard the words as she stepped out of the back area. She stood still for a few seconds, as if trying to memorize every word. The reporter continued to ask, "Do you feel discriminated against?" Elias looked straight into the camera, not avoiding it. But his answer silenced the entire station hall. "I don't want to make this my story. Let the facts speak. The video is all there. What matters is not how I feel, but what we can learn from this." The answer took Marissa by surprise. Her whole body stiffened, not defensively, but with a kind of calm that made it less of an accusation and more of a warning. She continued to ask, "So what do you think is most important right now?" Elias looked back toward the aircraft door area where several technicians were still moving hurriedly. "The most important thing is that all passengers are safe. And the second thing is that we learn to listen, even when the speaker is not what we expect." Again there was a long silence, not a silence of confusion, but a silence of sympathy that rippled out. At that same moment, Ruby's phone vibrated continuously. She glanced at it, then looked up in panic. "Elias, look at this." She handed him the screen. A post from a major news site appeared. "Passenger prevents potential disaster after staff misjudged warning." Below, hundreds of comments. "If not him, then who?" It's scary when a warning is disregarded simply because the speaker doesn't look like someone trustworthy. This is all too familiar to many people of color. Respect should never be categorized. Elias stood still for a moment. The words on the screen seemed to strike at memories deep within him, memories he didn't want to relive, but never really went away. He said slowly, "I don't do this because I want to change the world. I just don't want anyone to pay the price for that disregard, like I did." Ruby placed her hand on his arm as light as an invisible nod. While Elias remained to speak to reporters, an emergency meeting was held at AeroVista headquarters. The airline's CEO Robert Klein called the airport manager. "I want to see that guest immediately. And I want the full incident report within the hour." Outside on the platform, a strong wind blew, causing the AeroVista flag to flutter, as if to signal something bigger was coming. As the reporter left, Nina approached. Her face looked relieved but a little confused. "Elias, you better prepare yourself. This won't stop here." Elias smiled slightly. "I know. But if things have dragged me into it, I will step forward, not avoid it. As long as it does something better for those who come after me." Ruby looked at Elias. Nina looked at Elias. A strange moment when two different women realized the same thing. You're not just saving a flight, you're changing something bigger than yourself. Even though he didn't know it yet, it had already begun. News of the flight incident and video of the tense minutes rippled through Northwest Point like a current through the network. It took less than an hour for things to go beyond a canceled flight. It became a matter of honor, safety, and the culture of an entire airline. Meanwhile, Elias Moore stood at the large glass door looking down at the runway where AeroVista AV392 was surrounded by engineering vehicles. People were moving about, carrying equipment, pulling ropes, shining lights, all looking like they were mending the faith of an airline in free fall. Elias crossed his arms over his chest, not because he was cold, but because he was trying to keep his emotions within a calm framework. He was used to these moments, moments where the silence between him and the outside world grew thick, moments where he had to decide whether to step forward or retreat. Ruby Dawson stood nearby, looking at Elias with an understanding gaze. She knew what he was thinking but didn't interfere. She just stood there, a moral support, saying nothing, but enough to make him feel less alone. A few minutes later, a man walked briskly toward them. He was not a passenger, not a technician, not even security. He wore a dark blue suit and an ash-gray tie, and walked with the manner of someone accustomed to handling major crises, each stride, sure, each breath in time, each glance scanning the space as if to take in the entire situation. Ruby realized it immediately. She exclaimed softly, "That is, CEO." Robert Klein stopped a few feet from Elias. His face was lined with tension, but his sharp eyes held the determination of a man who knew this was not a day to make mistakes. He held out his hand. "Mr. Moore, I'm Robert Klein." Elias shook his hand. Klein's grip was strong, firm, but not imposing. There was only the heaviness of someone who knew he was about to hear the starkest truth. Klein said slowly, "I'm here because the incident on the flight can't be resolved over the phone. I want to hear it from you." The surrounding noise seemed to recede a few steps. Elias replied gently, "I'm willing to share, but what I have to say won't be easy to hear." Klein nodded. "It's okay. The truth is often hard to hear, but it's the truth nonetheless." He invited Elias to come with him to a small room near the boarding gate, a makeshift conference room with frosted glass walls and two chairs facing each other. Ruby and Nina did not follow. But before Elias left, Ruby said softly, "Don't hold back anything important." Elias replied with a calm look, "I never hold back what needs to be said." Inside the room, Klein placed 2 bottles of water on the table and sat down. Elias sat opposite, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his palms open as if he had nothing to hide. Klein begins, "I saw the video, I saw the technical report, and I heard your conversation with the flight attendant. Is there anything else you would like to add?" Elias thought for a few seconds, then said, "I don't want to make this a personal attack. What I want is one thing: to see respect given its due place. Klein bowed his head slightly. I understand. And I want to know, where do you think the problem starts? Elias took a deep breath. He remembered the moment when Alyssa asked him to leave his seat just because a familiar passenger had just boarded. He remembered the look in Charles's eyes when he declared, that seat is mine by default. He remembered Alyssa's hesitation when he warned him about the risk of an oil leak. He spoke slowly and clearly. From the moment people looked at me and didn't see the person sitting in the chair, only seeing skin color, only seeing preconceived notions in their minds, only seeing what they thought I couldn't be. Klein was silent. Elias continued, when I report a mechanical problem, the first thing they think is he messed up, not he might be right, and that is the difference between an accident and safety. Klein sighed, hands clasped together, and so, they disregarded his warning. Elias nodded. If I were a white man wearing a Prada suit and expensive watch, would they consider me a harasser? Klein did not answer, because he knew, no matter what answer he gave, it would be wrong. Elias continued, I've lived long enough to know one thing: stories like this happen every day. Not everyone is lucky enough to be caught on camera. Not everyone is lucky enough to save themselves. And not everyone is lucky enough to live to say, I told you but you didn't believe me. Klein bowed his head. Elias looked at him, not to win the conversation, but to say what he needed to hear. His company doesn't just have a technical problem. His company has a people problem. A heavy silence fell over the room. The minutes passed like hours. Finally, Klein raised his head, his eyes heavy but deep. Mr. Moore, what do you want the company to do? Elias leaned forward. His voice was not loud, but it had weight. The company must do more than apologize. It must change the way its employees are trained. It must rewrite the way it evaluates passenger speech. It must stop putting the privileges of a few above the safety of all. Klein closed his eyes for a few seconds. Elias saw in that expression not rebellion but pain at the realization that the entire system might have gone off track. Elias continued, and finally, the company needs to publicly admit that they were wrong. Klein opened his eyes. He looked at Elias for a long time, then said, what you ask for is not small. It touches the cultural structure of the entire organization. It touches the ego of the employees. It touches the honor of the company. Elias replied, not changing also affects passenger safety, and honor is lost even more. Klein leaned back in his chair, his hands on the table, as if he had stopped resisting and was listening with the heart of a leader. Elias said the last sentence, the sentence that made Klein sit up straight. You can't fix today's mistakes, but you can make tomorrow better. Those words seemed to untie a knot deep in Klein's chest. He nodded slowly, like someone who had just realized he could no longer fear the truth. Klein stood up. Mr. Moore, I will publicly admit our mistakes. I will conduct an internal culture investigation. And I want you to join me in rebuilding our safety procedures and service attitudes. Elias was slightly stunned. He did not expect this. Klein continued, not because you were the victim of today's flight, but because you saved the airline from disaster. Elias stood up and looked Klein straight in the eye. The moment was no longer a conversation between a client and a CEO. It was more like a commitment between two men who saw a responsibility greater than themselves. Elias replied, his voice soft but firm, if I do, it won't be for the company. It will be for the people in the future who don't have to go through what I went through today. Klein nodded, as if accepting an unwritten agreement, but stronger than any legal document. When Elias walked out of the room, Ruby and Nina were waiting right outside. Ruby looked at him worriedly. Are you okay? Elias sighed softly. Okay. And things are about to change. Nina asked, change for the better? Elias smiled. A small smile, but deep. And with light we will make it better. Ruby looked at him. Nina looked at him. They both understood this was no longer an airplane discrimination case. It was a shake-up, a wake-up call. A huge wake-up call to the entire airline industry. And the initiator was just a man who saw an oil stain on the wing of an airplane. The afternoon at Northwest Point Airport was winding down. The last rays of sunlight fell slowly on the polished floor, drawing long shadows like weary streaks of time. But inside the arrivals area, the atmosphere was the complete opposite. It felt like the center of a massive swirling storm. And the eye of that storm is heading toward Elias Moore. He stood in the middle of the lobby near the wide windows overlooking the runway. His face showed no sign of discomfort or regret, just something light and deep, like the peace that comes after a good decision, even if it comes with an unexpected wave. Ruby Dawson and Nina Beaumont stood nearby, not leaving Elias's side. They understood that even if Elias wasn't looking for the spotlight was looking for him. The atmosphere suddenly changed when a series of large screens in the airport simultaneously broadcast the news: AeroVista Flight 392 canceled due to hydraulic leak detected by passenger. Viral video sparks debate on racial bias and safety culture. Who is Elias Moore, the man who may have saved 186 lives? An airport employee ran by looking at the screen and said to the person next to him, "Wow, I've never seen something spread so fast. It's already national news in just a few hours." Beside him, a young girl whispered, "That man really saved everyone." An elderly man standing next to him replied, "Not only did he save us, he showed us the truth." At this moment, Ruby's phone started to vibrate continuously. She looked down in surprise, then looked up with an almost incredulous expression. "Elias, there are reporters from 3 national TV channels coming. Not just local news anymore." Elias turned to her, his eyes calm. "I knew it would be like this." Nina bit her lip. "So what will you do?" Elias breathed slowly. "I didn't choose this. It chose me. And if it chose me, I'll face it." Ruby looked at Elias, feeling a mixture of worry and admiration. She could see clearly Elias wasn't someone who pushed himself into the role of a hero. He was just doing the right thing. But it was that simplicity that made him more believable than any statement from a major airline. A few minutes later, the crowd poured in. Not loud, not chaotic, but full of energy. Residents, tourists, reporters, passengers who had just boarded another flight, all of them looking around curiously for the man mentioned in the video. A male reporter stepped forward, his voice low. "Mr. Moore, according to a source, the CEO of AeroVista, met with you in person. Is that correct?" Elias replied softly. "Yes, we talked." A female reporter asked immediately, "How did he react to the incident? Did he try to defend the company?" Elias shook his head. "No, he listened. And that's important." A short answer, but enough to make some people in the crowd look at each other. It was not spiteful, not bitter. It was so honest that it made people feel. Elias did not want to make enemies. He wanted to make change. Another reporter chimed in, "Mr. Moore, a lot of people are talking about discrimination on flights. Do you believe that's at the heart of today's story?" Elias looked around, his eyes touching each person as if he wanted to talk to the whole crowd, not just the person asking the question. "I don't think it's just discrimination. I think it's a disregard for what should be heard. Anyone can be ignored, and that today almost cost lives." The crowd fell silent. A few people took deep breaths. A black woman standing in the back spoke softly. "He is speaking for many of us." An old white man replied, "He is speaking for all of us." While the crowd surrounded Elias, in the AeroVista executive area, CEO Robert Klein remained in his temporary office. He called every department, every team leader, every leader. His voice was urgent but very clear. "I don't want a report to deal with. I want the truth. I want the full timeline. Who gave the orders? Who ignored the warnings? Who acted inappropriately? All of it." The HR department replied tremblingly, "Sir, this could create a strong internal reaction," Klein said bluntly. "If an organization is afraid to face mistakes, then mistakes will become its culture." That statement left the listener on the other end completely silent. Klein continued, "And starting tomorrow, I want to launch an internal culture investigation. All levels of management must participate. Back to Elias, where he was still in the middle of questioning. A young reporter asked Mr. Moore, "The fact that you remained calm in the video made many people curious. You weren't angry, you didn't lose control." Elias smiled gently. "I was so used to losing my temper when I was misunderstood, and then I realized, every time I lost my temper, people only saw the anger. They didn't see the reason." Nina stood next to him, her heart choking as she heard that. Ruby stood still, her hands clasped together as if holding back an emotion. Elias continued, "So I learned to let the truth speak for me." A middle-aged man in the crowd suddenly spoke loudly, "And today, the truth has silenced us." A wave of emotion swept through the crowd. No one applauded, they just stood there, silent and absorbed. Because sometimes silence is the greatest kind of respect. Suddenly, Elias's phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated and then picked up. "Mr. Moore, I'm Robert Klein." The CEO's voice sounded hurried but sincere. "I know you're surrounded by a lot of people, but I want to give you a heads up. AeroVista has decided to launch a full investigation, and I want you at an official press conference tomorrow morning. We'll tell the truth to the whole country." Elias was silent for a second. "Are you sure?" Klein replied. "I can't fix the past, but I can start tomorrow, and I want the person who saved that flight to stand by me while we do the right thing." Elias looked out the window where the sun had already set behind the train station. The last of the evening light was fading. He said slowly, "Okay, I'll be there." Klein exhaled. "Thank you, Moore. You didn't just save a flight. You helped us see something we'd forgotten." Elias hung up. Ruby looked at him, her voice low. "Good news?" Elias smiled, slightly. "Timely news." Nina asked, "So, what are you planning to do now?" Elias replied, "I'm going home to rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Ruby smiled slightly for the first time since the incident. Tomorrow may not only be long, but also the day the world will look squarely in the eye. Elias nodded. "And if they look, I want them to see the truth." He turned away, carrying his old backpack and the steady steps of a man who knew full well that this story did not end here. It's just the beginning. Night fell over the city like a blanket over the noise of the day. The lights of Interstate 405 streaked the cab's windshield. Elias Moore leaned back in the back seat, eyes looking out, but his mind was far away beyond the buildings, past the traffic, past the stressful afternoon at Northwest Point Airport. The taxi took him to a small hotel near the city center. It wasn't a luxurious place, but it was quiet enough for him to sit with himself after a turbulent day. As he entered the hotel hallway, his footsteps echoed softly and evenly on the carpeted floor. It was warm but also empty in a way that was hard to describe. He opened the door and turned on the light. A soft yellow light spread out, not too bright, just enough to create a feeling of closeness. He put his backpack on the table and took a deep breath. Finally, after hours of being under the gaze of others, he had a moment alone. Elias sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was quieter than silent, a kind of silence where he could hear his own heart beating, slow, heavy, but clear. Throughout his life, he has experienced many things that would have exhausted others, times being questioned in a boardroom just because he was a black man leading a big project, times being stopped by the police just because he drove an expensive SUV, times people looked at him and automatically assumed he must not be the one to make the decision. But today is different. Today, lack of listening nearly killed nearly 200 people. Elias propped himself up on his hands and knees. He bowed his head. Slowly, he let out a long breath, the longest he had taken all day. He thought about the press conference tomorrow morning. It wouldn't be easy, not short, not simple. The moment he agreed to stand next to the AeroVista CEO, he knew he had just entered a war that no one had invited him to, but he was forced to join. Discrimination, even if it was masked in professionalism, never goes away when we avoid it. There was a soft knock on the door. Elias blinked. He stood up and walked to open the door. Ruby Dawson stood there still in her long coat, holding a steaming mug of coffee. Her face was slightly tired, but her eyes held the warmth Elias had grown accustomed to. "I know you probably want some quiet, but I think you need this," Ruby said softly, holding out her coffee cup. Elias smiled a very slight smile. "Thanks. I really need something warm tonight." Ruby entered the room at Elias's beckoning. She sat down in the chair by the window while Elias sat across from her. They sat in silence for a few minutes, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding of something that didn't need words. Ruby looked at Elias and asked her, voice reserved but sincere, "Are you scared?" Elias turned to her, his eyes deep as if holding all the years he had endured. "Yes, I'm afraid this will turn into a pointless argument. I'm afraid people will use this story to attack each other instead of looking at what's important. And I'm afraid." Ruby waited. Elias continued, "I fear people like me will again be seen as the problem instead of the alarmist." Ruby bowed her head, feeling the weight of those words weigh down the air. After a moment she said, "But you're not just speaking up for yourself. Many people need to hear what you have to say." Elias looked straight at her. "I know. And that's why I can't back down." Ruby smiled softly, a little choked up. "Are you always like this? Calm? Even when everything seems to be falling apart?" Elias exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "No. I used to get angry. I used to argue. I used to scream when people looked down on me. But then I realized if I raise my voice, people just look at the noise. But if I stay calm, sometimes they listen to what's important." Ruby looked at him for a long moment, as if remembering every word. Elias took a sip of coffee. It was hot, bitter, but heartwarming. He set the cup down on the table and looked out the window. Outside, the city lights reflected on the glass like tiny dots of light in the darkness. He said, his voice almost whispering, "Tomorrow morning, they're going to ask me a lot of questions. They're going to push me into every corner. They're going to test me to see if I'll get angry, if I'll lose my temper." Ruby nodded. "And what will you do?" Elias replied slowly. "I will say what needs to be said. Nothing more, nothing less." Late at night, Nina Beaumont also arrived. She knocked lightly on the door and entered with a small bag. "I don't know if you've had dinner yet. I bought some food to bring up." Elias chuckled. The two of them seemed to have coordinated well. Nina replied, "No. It's just, we all think you shouldn't be alone tonight." Elias looked at the two women before him, one strong, one delicate, both appearing just when he needed a voice other than his own. They sat around the table, eating a light meal in silence, punctuated by occasional small talk. Nina looked up. "Mr. Moore, I want you to know something. What you did today didn't just save us. It also showed the truth about how people are sometimes too quick to judge each other," Ruby continued. "And tomorrow, you'll have to say it in front of everyone. I know it's hard, but if not you, who will?" Elias looked at them. A look that was not showy, not oversharing, but deep and appreciative. He said, "Thanks, you two. Sometimes, I forget that I don't always fight alone." After Ruby and Nina left, Elias turned off all the lights except for the small night light. The dim yellow light covered the room in a thin layer of peace. He lay down on the bed, his hand on his forehead. He had trouble sleeping, not because he was afraid, but because he was preparing himself mentally. He thought of his mother, who taught him, "You won't always be heard, but that doesn't mean you should be silent." He thought about the first time he was mistreated on a plane when he was 22. He said nothing. He just kept quiet and endured. And he thought of today, where he stood up not only for himself, but also for those who would sit in the same seats as him one day. The quiet night gradually embraced him. The sound of the air conditioner ran steadily. The sound of cars on the street gradually faded away. Elias closed his eyes and let out a long breath, a breath that released the worries of the whole day. Tomorrow morning you will no longer be just the guy who spotted the oil slick. Tomorrow morning you will be the voice of the overlooked, and you know you cannot, must not, and should not back down. The story is no longer about him alone. It is no longer about one company. It is about how society sees each other. A small change can start with one person, And tonight, as I lie in this quiet room, I understand tomorrow will be the day you step into the light, not to be seen, but to be heard. He whispered to himself before falling asleep. Tomorrow, we start again. The next morning, the city sun was just rising, casting a soft golden glow over the glass buildings around the center. Outside the hotel where Elias Moore was staying, the atmosphere was different from the previous evening. Several reporters lined the entrance carrying cameras, microphones, and recording equipment. They weren't jostling too much, but their focus was clearly on a single name, Elias Moore. Elias walked out of the hotel lobby with Ruby Dawson and Nina Beaumont. They weren't behind him like assistants. They were beside him like witnesses to the truth, like people who knew the story beyond a viral video. The early morning sunlight shone on Elias's face, highlighting his calm. There was no sign of tension nor fear, only the serenity that one can only attain after truly facing oneself the night before. As Elias walked towards the car sent by AeroVista, reporters boarded in unison. "Mr. Moore, what are you going to say at the press conference? Do you think AeroVista's response so far is enough? Are you worried that this will put more pressure on you?" Elias did not stop. He just said softly, "I will say what needs to be heard, no more. Don't let the story get carried away with excess emotion." Ruby looked at him as he got into the car. "Are you okay?" Elias nodded. "Okay. Now it's time to let the truth guide you." Nina sat in the back seat, smiling slightly, and he did not go alone. The building hosting AeroVista's press conference this morning was packed. The front rows were filled with media, and behind them were senior airline staff. To the left of the auditorium, some of the passengers from yesterday's flight had also been invited, including Ruby and Nina. In the middle of the stage was a large podium with a blue AeroVista logo behind it. The spotlights gave the room an unusually solemn feel. It was so quiet you could hear the scratching of pens. Robert Klein, the company's CEO, stepped forward. His face, which had been worn down by the night before, was unusually determined today. Klein began, "Yesterday, we almost had a flight take off in an unsafe condition. And what was even more embarrassing was that important warning from a passenger was ignored." The first words sent shockwaves through the room. People looked at each other. Reporters turned their cameras on faster. AeroVista staff bowed their heads. Klein continued, "The technical problem is not something to be ashamed of. What is shameful is that we did not listen to the people who spoke up at the right time." He paused for a moment, then leaned to the right and held out his hand. "And today that person is standing next to me. Please, Mr. Elias Moore." Murmurs filled the auditorium. Several reporters stood up to get the best angle. Ruby and Nina looked at Elias with a mixture of pride and emotion. Elias stepped up to the podium with a slow, steady step. There was no air of boasting or pride. He stood next to the CEO, his hands clasped lightly before the podium, his eyes fixed on the audience. He said, "I didn't come here to blame. I didn't come here to claim credit." He stopped. The air fell silent. "I came here because ignoring a warning can cost lives." A reporter raised his hand. "Mr. Moore, do you think discrimination is the reason why the flight attendants didn't listen to you?" Elias did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then back at the crowd, his gaze a little sad but determined, I think. When people get used to seeing the world through categories, they forget that truth has no skin color, and the warning, whoever it comes from, deserves to be heard. A wave of sighs spread through the auditorium. He continued, his voice deep and low. "I hope yesterday is not a reason to condemn anyone. I hope it is a reason for us to change." Klein stood next to Elias, bowing his head slightly, like someone admitting something worth admitting. Elias continued, "If I hadn't seen that oil slick, if I had decided to stay silent, today could have been a very different day. Not just for AeroVista, but for all the families who were on the flight." His voice lowered. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who doesn't want anyone to experience what I experienced, not being heard." Some reporters bowed their heads. A few passengers wiped away tears. Elias continued, "My only wish is a world where all of us, regardless of our color, background, or position are treated with the utmost respect, and that respect can save lives. In the back of the room, an AeroVista employee began to cry, not because she was being blamed, but because she realized she had forgotten why she had chosen this profession in the first place: to protect people. CEO Klein stepped forward and stood next to Elias. "Our company is going to change. We're going to have new training. We're going to have a more transparent process for handling alerts, and we're going to work with Mr. Moore to build that culture." Elias was a little surprised by the statement that was announced right in front of the national media, but he saw seriousness and humility in Klein's eyes, and he nodded. A reporter asked loudly, "Mr. Moore, would you be willing to assist AeroVista in this restructuring?" Elias answered immediately without hesitation, "I would, if it would save people in the future from having to go through what I went through." There was silence. Then the first clap, soft but clear. Then a second, a third, and seconds later the entire room was on its feet, applauding. No one applauded because a man saw the oil slick. They applauded because a man said what they had known all along but had never dared to say. When the press conference ended, Ruby and Nina walked onto the stage. Ruby hugged Elias gently. "Good job." Nina smiled, a gentle and proud smile. "No, not just good. You did what so many people needed." Elias said nothing at first. He looked down at his hands. The same hands that had shaken with anger at 22. The same hands that had rested on the hinges of the plane yesterday. The same hands that had opened a new door today. He said, "I just hope others will be heard before something bad happens." Ruby touched his shoulder lightly, and today he made it possible. That afternoon, new video from the press conference spread across the internet. But this time it wasn't because of outrage. It spread because of one sentence: "Truth has no color." And the story of Elias Moore is no longer just the story of one flight. It becomes the story of millions of people who were once overlooked. A story to remind the world that one person standing up at the right time can change a whole system. Elias Moore's story reminds us of something simple yet profound. People often fall short not because of big things, but because of the small moments they overlook each other. Elias was just a passenger like any other, but his careless words nearly caused disaster. And what makes the story memorable above all is how he chose to face it. Not anger, not retaliation, not losing his dignity. He chose to keep his cool, to give the right a chance to be seen. In life, especially for those who have gone through many years, we understand that no one can avoid misunderstanding or judgment. But what makes us mature is the ability to stand firm in the face of injustice without losing our humanity and wisdom. Elias's story also shows a small word can save a flight, a respectful attitude can change a person. A timely action can correct a system, and sometimes to make a change we just need to not leave the chair we have a right to sit in. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this humane story. Hopefully, the small but true things in Elias Moore's journey will bring you reflection and faith in kindness. If you find the story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring content that touches hearts and spread better values every day.